From Second Stage Theater, see the new play from the writer NPR calls one of the hottest playwrights in America, with Kate Bornstein, Josh Charles, Ty Defoe, Armie Hammer, and Paul Schneider. See Straight White Men on Broadway for 10 weeks only. Visit 2st.com.
Not the house of cards that falls down easily. I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me.
Mental Health News Radio, produced by MHNRnetwork.com, your source for information about our favorite subject, mental health. This show is brought to you by our incredible sponsors like ZenCharts.com, the intelligent EHR for addiction treatment organizations, and MyGenetics, that's MyGenetx.com, changing the way people are diagnosed and treated around the world, helping you better understand what makes you well. Don't you want information about yourself that empowers your mental health treatment? Also, who is minding the store, the finances of your behavioral health organization? TriadicLLC.com, that's TriadicLLC.com, is a full-service revenue cycle management and billing company focused on all the ins and outs of mental health billing. Our sponsors help keep this show on the air and advocating for everyone affected by mental health. Guess who that is? Everyone in the world. Take a listen to our show all the way to the end. You don't want to miss Miles the Therapy Dog's special goodbye.
Hey everyone, this is Kristen Sananta-Walker, host of Mental Health News Radio, and I have a guest that was actually referred to us from another podcaster on our network, Dr. John Huber with Mainstream Mental Health. Her name is Helaina Hovitz, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. She's an editor, a writer, a content strategist, a speaker, and the author of the memoir After 9/11. She has written for and worked with 50 publications, including the New York Times, Salon, Glamour, Reader's Digest, Forbes. Wow, the list goes on and on. She is a mental health advocate, yay, nonprofit enthusiast, rescue dog lover, and at 28 has dined at approximately 5 million billion restaurants. Helaina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You caught me between restaurants, so...
I love that. So let's get to the most important thing first, which is the dog lover.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, I currently have him right here with me. So he kind of alternates between being attached to my hip and then picking which of the most expensive throw pillows we own to make his throne and curl himself on. So he's a rescue, and we're not quite sure how old he is. We know that he's a Chihuahua mix, and he thinks that he is a giant pit bull when it comes to being on the street in the outside world, and that his job is to protect me from other dogs and anyone else in our apartment building who dares to leave their apartment, which he feels he needs to alert me of. And it's very cute, but rescue dogs are so amazing, and I've always been a huge animal lover, and I do some volunteer social media for rescues and organizations that are doing wonderful things with dogs and therapy dogs. And the really, I didn't realize this until I reflected on it and figuring out how to end my own book. But, rescue dogs are so much like people, who've been through, whether it's something traumatic or overcome, living with certain mental illnesses or disorders or issues, because, all it takes is one person or a community to say, like, your life matters this much, and, we're gonna work to make you better and give you a better life. And I looked back and I was like, wow, when you meet someone, you don't know their whole story. You don't know what happened to them. Same way, dogs can't talk and tell you either. You're only seeing who they are now in the present. And I feel like so many people who live with any sort of challenges, emotional, physical, you don't know upon meeting them where they've been, what they go through. And it's the same with dogs, right?
That's so true.
And you really depend, and so they present themselves to you with their flaws and looking for love. their wonderful qualities. And I think it's kind of the same with people. And, you know, they're so resilient, just like people are so resilient, but you need support to be resilient. And that is one of the largest connections I've made. And not to go on answering this question too long, but one of the things that I learned as I learned to shift my own perspective after I started to really come out on the other side of my journey of years kind of really suffering and then trying to make it through a lot of the challenges I faced, was that once you shift your perspective, it's really amazing. Like I always used to avoid anything, any visuals like ASPCA commercials or anything online that had to do with dogs in shelters or rescues, because I really, no matter what, I always be very, very sensitive on the spectrum of sensitive people, and I just couldn't handle it. But what I started to do was see the rescue movement and look at all the people that were helping, that were good people, that were volunteering, and the fact that these dogs were rescued, that so many of them are given another chance, and to really shift the way I looked at it, because that goes for so many things in life, right? You can see the bad or you can see the good, or how the bad leads to the good. So that made a big difference. And that really,
it's very true. I've got a good friend of mine that I should introduce you to. His name's Jeff Fink, and he's got a company called Go Fetch Wellness, and it's all about putting dogs together with people that are struggling with mental health issues. So he's going to love this show. Well,
awesome.
Yeah. So talk to me about, and our listeners about, a little bit about your struggles with mental health. And then, is that, I'm assuming that's what brought you into wanting to be an advocate.
Absolutely. I kind of realized I was an advocate not so long ago. My story, and I'll keep this succinct, but I was in school on 9/11, a couple of blocks from the World Trade Center, and I was 12 years old, and I lived on the other side of the World Trade Center a few blocks away. So if you think about it as like a circle with the World Trade Center in the middle, and you drew a straight line between it. So that day, a neighbor was actually dropping off her son late, and our plan was to just get home. My grandparents lived in the building too, and I knew my parents wouldn't be able to get downtown in time because they worked in, respectively, Rockefeller Center, and my dad in Staten Island as a special ed teacher. And we didn't, in hindsight, of course, it seems like, oh my God, why would you do that? But at the time, we just thought we had to get home. And what ended up happening was that we got caught in everything at the base of the towers for an hour, trying to find in to get home. And the cops wouldn't let us through because they wanted everyone out, which makes sense. So we tried for an hour, and we were in the street in really close proximity during both collapses. And so what ended up happening was, for that night and for 2 weeks, it became a war zone down here, basically. And over time, the school got relocated, and we got from there, the rest of the city got back, quote unquote, to normal pretty quickly. But for 6 months, there was still the smog in the air down here, and the National Guard, and the dirt and the smell, and people started going to Ground Zero and taking pictures, smiling in front of it. And it was very, and I didn't know it then, and I didn't find out until I was 18 or 19 that what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress disorder. And what started to happen was my symptoms really kicked up hard when I got to high school and got worse and worse. And I really, my parents and I wanted me to get better. I always had a very positive view of therapy and I was just like, I can't live like this. I mean, I went through 3 different high schools in 4 years, and we thought, maybe changing location, but everywhere I went, there I was, and every day was such a struggle. And I can get into more detail if you'd like, but it was really hard. And it got to the point where when I was in college, it was so bad that I really was considering actually going through with ending my life. And, fortunately, I reached out on a kind of last hope, truly, to a cognitive behavioral therapist that I was referred to. And I emailed her and I told her what was happening, and I just sent it off, and I was like, it's probably not even going to answer me. And I probably sound crazy. And she was like, can you come see me next week? And that was when things started to change. And so throughout college, I saw her, and I then saw a dialectical behavioral therapist. And when I was 22, I got sober. So I've been sober 6 years, and all of that kind of really experiencing it and looking back, you know, I was misdiagnosed manic depressive, bipolar,
Right.
AD. No one mentioned PTSD. And what really got me was that I later found out that there was a note in my psychiatrist's file, and she sent me over to the cognitive behavioral therapist, and it said secondhand trauma due to 9/11. And I didn't find that out until I went back and started writing my book. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it was like a little bit frustrating, right? Because everything was stuff, it was all there. And so that I really dug deep in researching for my book, and I realized that like misdiagnosis is a huge
problem.
Yeah, especially with kids and teenagers, because they don't have the words, you know, they don't have the tools. Like a 12-year-old isn't going to be like, oh, well, I'm experiencing, I can definitely connect my overreactivity and my impulsivity and my hyper-arousal to, you know, fighting with my parents so extremely. Like, that's not gonna, you know, so I started to look at that. And I also certainly do not at all, I'm not here to like villainize professionals. I think everyone who treated me, they did the best they could. They did what they thought was the right thing, because when you have a patient that's presenting with severe symptoms, you want to say, okay, like what's the most severe thing? What's the immediate plan of treatment? And when it comes to trauma, that's a whole other special form of training for therapists and psychiatrists. So, you know, I really, I started to say, you know, we need a voice around this, not just when it comes to young people, but when it comes to everyone. And the reason was twofold. The first is because the statistics is that 1 in 2 kids in this country will go through something traumatic, whether that's a natural disaster, the loss of a parent. You know, there's so many things that are traumatic for people, a domestic violence situation, really. So, and the other thing is that so many adults are living with it, but they don't know they're living with it. So, and they don't know that there's a way to feel better and be better. And the other layer of it is 9/11, because it took me 5 years to get one publisher to say yes to this book. I went through 4 different agents. We went through 1 million publishers, and everyone was like, your story is really compelling, but 9/11 isn't marketable. And it came down to, and I said, you know, I would say to my agent, I completely disagree with that, because every time I tell someone about my book, they tear up and they start talking about their experience that day. So clearly, you know, I don't know who decided, like, yes, of course we move on and it was a long time ago, but people are constantly we're made up of our stories and our history. And it's clearly everyone in some way that I have encountered, at least, still feels a strong connection to that day where they were. You know, even I've spoken to some classrooms via Skype that have read my book, you know, and they write me letters and emails, and they say, you know, we lost someone in our family, or my dad is a pilot and I worry about because I know what happened. It's really unbelievable. And then there's,
especially for native New Yorkers. I mean, yes. There are
hundreds of thousands of people that are still affected by it, whether it's physically or mentally or emotionally, who are enrolled in the, you know, the health registry. And I've spoken to first responders who say that they still can't even watch the coverage, that they've never been to the memorial. Like, it's that painful. It's that raw. And that's why I think you can go so long without thinking, maybe I could use some work or some help or some support around it. We think that we have to be strong and move on, but moving on is very different from, you know, actually coping and being resilient and moving on in a healthy way, so that you can reconcile what happened and move into the future, rather than still kind of feel the sting of what happened in the present, even though it's so many years later.
Oh, absolutely. That another one of our podcasters, Steve Kavalkovich, was a first responder, and his show Rescue the Rescuer, he interviews first responders, and that's one of the major topics is you're there on the front lines when things like 9/11 happen, and what do you do with that? You, the person that is there, and someone that's there consistently, that's your job. Those stresses take a toll. And a lot of them, like Stephen, like you, become advocates. So that's the inspiring part of it. But you do have to have some place to figure out all the turmoil that's going on within you after what you've been through.
Yeah, absolutely.
That resilience piece is huge. In terms of, now, obviously, you're a writer. That's what you do for your work. But what inspired you to, writing a book is a journey. Believe me, we're writing one for our network right now. And it's a lot of work. So obviously what compelled you was your experience with 9/11, but taking it all the way to the level of putting it into a book. What motivated you to go all the way through that journey? Because believe me, I know how difficult it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It started in college, and it started with, and I always shout him out because it's such a wonderful story, with a professor who was I adore him. His name is Mark Statman, and he taught poetry, of which I thank him for it. I got, because I look back, this is just awful. He was very generous because he saw how enthusiastic I was. I think that contributed to my A- or whatever. I'm very glad I didn't go down that road. And he also specialized in translation work. And I approached him and I said, the 10-year anniversary is coming up. And this year, my last year of college, I had a couple of years of the correct therapy under my belt. And I said, I think I'm ready to look back and maybe just write about what happened to me that day, because I feel like it's been inside me and I'm thinking about it. And he's like, well, I do independent studies on poetry and Spanish translations. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe this will be a collection of poetry. And of course it wasn't. And he still extended it to me to the end of the year. And I wrote about that day, and I started to write about my childhood. And for my senior thesis with my professor in my advanced journalism class, I wrote a collection of stories about life after 9/11, which was everything from watching my grandmother's health decline as someone who I was with, that day. And then unfortunately, we went through so many health things with her over the decade that followed. And beyond that, she was a tough lady, but she made it through a lot of things that, and a lot of people, I think, wouldn't health wise. And I wrote about that. And I wrote about, the homeless shelter, the only homeless shelter in Lower Manhattan that was looking to fundraise. And, so it was this collection of essays. And at the time I was also interning at a publishing house, and I kind of floated the idea on my last day to the vice president. And he's like, I'm like, do you think that there's something here? And he's like, well, yeah, no one's written about a child's perspective on 9/11. And so I pitched the story to Sarah Hepola at Salon while I was still in college. And she's like, have you gone back and talked to your other classmates? And I was like, oh. So I got in touch with 16 kids and I interviewed them. I interviewed their parents, and I said, oh my gosh, because it really occurred to me when I was talking to Sarah about, it couldn't have just been me, right? Like, I know that I was one of the, like a lot of the other kids managed to get, the school was evacuated. They managed to get out of the area. Like, they didn't necessarily live downtown, but a lot of kids did. And they were so severely affected by it. And they didn't know either that they were living with PTSD. And I heard so much of myself and been through in their stories. Like, I threw furniture at my parents, or, I isolated from everyone. I hated everyone. I thought about like killing myself. I started drinking too much. I cut myself. It was just so much. And I read off the symptoms of PTSD without telling them, and they were just like that, all of that. And I was like, wow. And that's when I realized that I needed to try and be a voice for this entire generation that was affected by that day and the subsequent world that we lived in. Because it's not like it happened and then we all went back to living in Pleasantville, right? As like the movie was. It was now a world full of suicide bombers and anthrax and other bomb threats and just chaos and red alert in the city and in the country, right? I mean,
Yep.
these attacks in other states. And so when you hear about the 9/11 generation, it's not just kids who were here, but kids
absolutely. My son is the same age as you, and when this happened, he immediately, and we aren't a military family, he immediately said, I'm joining the military, and he did.
Yeah.
And that's a huge decision for a 12-year-old to make. And we kept looking at him like, there's no way that you're going to do that. That's not you. And boy, did he. Made the decision to do that during wartime even. But you're right. It affected kids all over the United States, all over the world, of course, but especially, in the United States, it changed the trajectory of your lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Fascinating. So you went through the process, you wrote the book, and then you had your struggles with getting it published. How was it after you got it published, and, what was that journey like for you?
In starting to, it was the 15th anniversary coming up. And so I started to do interviews and write different articles and essays for different publications. And when I would do interviews on the phone and I would recount my experience in a lot of detail from that day, the days that followed, because really it's so loaded that I could talk forever about it. But I started to notice that even though I felt calm on this, I felt very calm. I was like, that went well, that was fine. I was starting to overall have trouble sleeping again. I've gotten chronic migraines since I was 17, and I started to get worse, and my stomach was and I was like, well, this is really strange because my body is reacting even though
right.
I'm fine with this. I wrote to the trauma specialist who provided the foreword to my book, and I said, this is so strange. You know my story. You know that I've done CBT therapy and DBT therapy. I've been sober for a number of years, and I did all this active work because that's really, and I include that in the book too, because I feel like too often in books or in movies, it's like something really traumatic happens, and then it's like, oh, and then I was better, or then I got normal, and then things get to normal. And it's like, my hardcore mission with this book was, no, I'm going to walk people through what I did in CBT and DBT and in 12-step programs, because I want people to see how that change happens. And it's like learning anything new, like in school, like you have to do the work, you have to do the homework, you have to be willing to change, you have to be willing to do what's uncomfortable and hear things that you don't want to hear, and so I felt that was really important to include. So she knew all of this, and I said, why would this still be happening? Like, why would my body be responding? And she's like, well, I don't see that you've done anything to directly treat the trauma itself and how you processed it. Like, you did a lot of behavioral modification, but you haven't targeted the way your brain and your body process the trauma.
Right.
And I was like, what? Because I thought at this point, I thought I had learned I thought I had learned mostly. You always have more to learn and you need to remain teachable. But I thought that I had it covered and I was past that. And it just goes to show that, you're never done learning new things. And
right.
Thankfully the curiosity and the desire to consistently keep improving, because as human beings, we're always a work in progress. We're never like, and done. I am perfect. I need to change again. So she said, have you heard of EMDR? And I was like, what's EMDR? And she's like, well, it's this eye movement desensitization reorientation, and it's almost like a bad comparison would be hypnotherapy, but it helps you reprocess it. And so I went to pursue that, and it was unbelievable to me the way that when I really checked into my body and the sensations when I was processing the actual moments with her, it was so insightful. And because I wrote the book and because I had that experience, I then unlocked a whole other door to this new level of healing, and getting better. And that was really, it made it all worth it. And I also look back and I realized that I'm really bad at giving up. I think anyone else, when they go through so much rejection, so much rejection, so many, failed attempts. So, and especially when it's so deeply personal, you have to really detach from your book and yourself, right? Even if it's a memoir, even if it's about mental health, because you have to understand that the rejection's not about a reflection on you. But like when you just keep getting, it's really hard. We're talking about 5 years. So that's a lot of days full of, no, sorry, and shifting that. And I just realized I was like almost ready to light a candle for what could have been, because sometimes you have to listen to the universe when it's like, you need to stop. This is not a good idea. I've done everything.
Oh, believe me. Yes.
I know.
Money's running low and you're like, okay, seriously, I need to do something with my life because this isn't working. And
And I was, it's interesting because I look back now, and really every step of my journey led me to finding the right agent, to finding a publisher. And if the book had been published when I was 22, 23, and the way that my first agent wanted to put the book out and what she wanted it to be, it would have been a completely different story. And I wouldn't have had all the hindsight I had, even after getting sober, which is when I really became a different person, a better person, and started to see things more clearly. And so everything really does happen for a reason, and it was just not on my timetable. So I'm really glad I didn't give up, and I'm really glad that it was 5 years later, because I was able to have that kind of hope and insight that that you need to write a memoir, because no one wants to just be dragged through all these pages of devastation and then the end, so I became a stronger writer, and it really happened when it was supposed to. So I look back and I'm like, I'm really glad I hung in there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's true. I mean, of course, digging deeper into yourself and healing your wounds and things like that, that's going to enrich whatever job it is you have. I mean, of course, it doesn't matter if you are waiting tables, and it's going to enrich that experience. However, when you are a writer, or you do a podcast, or, you do something where you're communicating, peeling back the layers to yourself, you only get better at your job when you take those deep dives. So it's really interesting that you realized that, and you were able to process those things and those experiences, because you're right. I'm sure it added so many different flavors to your book.
Yeah.
And it's going to influence, obviously, your future writing as well. So you're right. You never give up. I've said this on shows before, so listeners forgive me, but I had a friend of mine he was about, I guess, late 30s when he said this to me, maybe mid 30s. And he said, when do you get to that place, where you just know that you're going to be okay? Like when do you know that, where you're finally like, okay, I've got this? And I said, when you're dead. I mean, that's life. Well, let's talk about your, becoming an advocate and doing the work that you do with nonprofits. I know this because I was doing advocacy work in mental health from the time I was very, very young in grade school. So, but not everybody, chooses to do that. So obviously 9/11 had a significant impact on that as well. But not everybody chooses to go and be an advocate even after an experience like that. So what do you think, is it about you that makes you want to give back in that way?
I always, from the time I had my first byline at 18 in a local paper, I knew that my work in life had to be meaningful, and it had to be positive, and it had to help people in some way. And that first story was about a rescue mission that was a homeless shelter for men who wanted to get sober. Ironically, I didn't see myself in their stories or see the irony in that until years later. But I became really interested in telling their stories, not just the details of how they got to where they were, but how much work they were putting into changing things for themselves, and how it was so much harder than people think to really, there's work if they want it, they can get help if they want. It's not that simple at all.
Right.
And so, and what ended up happening was I wrote an entire series over the next couple of years for this shelter, because they were trying to raise money to build another floor. And I got a call one day and they were like, hey, so we raised it and we just wanted you to know that a lot of people who donated mentioned your articles. And I'm getting goosebumps now saying that. And I was like, wow, I can like really do something good. You know, people would ask me, because they knew I wanted to be a journalist since I was like literally in elementary school in the school paper, when I wrote about such pressing issues as the condition people were leaving the girls' bathroom in, and how to care for your hair holistically. So I and in college, people would say to me like, well, when they knew my experience, well, how are you going to be a journalist? Because the news and the media are just all about fear and violence and war and horrible things. Like, how are you going to do that? And I was just like, I don't know how, but I'm not going to cover those things. I'm going to find a way. And so for over that time, I really forged the same way that I forged ahead with the book. Like, I found ways to tell these stories about like nonprofits, about social good, inspiring stories where I could. And that meant giving it away for free for a couple of years to Forbes and Huffington Post and getting different because they were the only ones who would let me write about this. And then I got involved with a couple of startups, and, you know, I kept going and going and going. And then I started to expand and realize that there are other ways to help people and write positive stories in the health space and the mental health space. And so I started to write there. And that's when I got really into advocacy through my writing and through storytelling and through journalism and through advice and through informative stories, all these different ways that I could reach people who weren't necessarily looking, right? Because that's the whole point, is that so many of us don't necessarily realize what we could be doing better or what we might be experiencing and how that's impacting our life and our choices and our experience of the everyday and our ability to function. And so it was so wonderful when I started to find outlets to allow me to write these pieces, because that's when I felt like, okay, this is going to help people. And it you know, I wish I was this popular. My Facebook page and my inbox doesn't flood with emails from people every day. But when I do get a message that I've helped someone, or that I've moved someone, or that they're now going to go try this therapy, or they're now understanding why they're doing something the way they are, like, for me,
isn't that the best feeling in the whole world?
It's the best. And I also, you know, what was the point, right, of my going through everything I did if I couldn't use that for good? I believe that we have to do something productive. Like, we have to find a silver lining in literally every experience. And sometimes that's just seeing that we could get through it. You know, I have a really wise friend. Her name's Regal, and she is like a mindfulness teacher. And I say to her, I'm like, you know, I always try to figure out in hindsight, or like what I learned from this, or what the meaning was, or why it happened. And I can't, like, this just kind of sucked. And she was like, yeah, but you got through it, and that's the right point. And I was like, okay, that works for me. So,
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, and not everybody has that, you know, that attitude. I grew up in a lot of trauma, and I always thought I was a pessimist and, you know, glass half full person. And when you're highly empathic, you're so influenced by the people you're around. You know, just everyone is, of course, but when you're really a sensitive person, it changes the entire way you view the world. I didn't realize until I was an adult that I'm actually an optimist. And it's because I had to, you know, work through so much stuff to get to this place where I naturally rest, which is optimism. And, you know, that's where you naturally rest, obviously. And it does make a huge difference in the quality of your life and your ability to go out there and inspire others. So I get it. We'll be doing our shows and doing, you know, all this advocacy and, you know, get in the drudgery of our work. And then all of a sudden we get an email from somebody saying, you know, then in Spain or wherever, and saying, thank you so much. I listen to you every night and you've really helped. And we think, okay, yeah, we needed that, because that's why we do this.
Yeah.
And
It's true.
I love that piece. I love that you shared that, you did a lot of pro bono stuff to get your name out there. People don't realize, and a lot of millennials that I've been around have said, well, they get all this education and then they get a little bit, some people have gotten a little bit superior, like, well, I have all this education. I'm not doing this or that or the other. And I always say, you got to do a bunch of free stuff. You just do to get yourself out there. You got to be willing to do it.
Yeah. And, the reason I did it wasn't even, it's funny because I wasn't looking at it as like getting myself out there, because I already kind of had these publications that were, fairly, I don't know, impressive, I guess, like for my age and for where I was. And it was really just that I was so determined to spread awareness for these organizations and write stories that made me feel really good and feel really hopeful, because you really have to build the world that works for you, right? You have to like put your blinders on and say, this is where I want to focus my attention. This is meaningful to me, and that's why I got a day job. And I just did this because I would have written for any site that would have let me do it and helped raise awareness and funds and gain volunteers for all these organizations. Like it really almost, when you get sober, there's a large emphasis on like service, or, the normie word for it would probably be like being helpful or volunteering, right?
Right.
And so I looked at it as a service. Like I was like, this is my skill. This is what I can do, right? And it might not be spooning out food at a homeless shelter, but this is what I can do to use my skills for good to help these folks. And maybe it was a little selfish just because I really loved writing these stories. I loved it. And it certainly didn't, I just liked being able to say to them like, hey, guess what? Like you're on Forbes or you're on Huffington Post, like, so that I knew that they were reaching people that they might not normally reach with stories that were really moving, and hoping that would, start a chain of events that would lead to them growing and getting better. Obviously, people would say to me the exact same thing, like, it certainly doesn't hurt to be in Forbes. And I'm like, well, I guess, like it definitely doesn't hurt to be a writer, contributor for Forbes, but that wasn't the big motivation. That was kind of just like a cherry on top. And it would have been nice to, with journalism, you don't go into journalism to get rich. You don't write a book to get rich. You certainly don't get into social good nonprofit journalism. That is not super lucrative. But it didn't matter to me because I'll tell you, it sounds very, it's a little sappy, but my dad, I used to go to take your daughter to Workday with him. And, as I mentioned earlier, he was a special ed high school teacher. And he told me he would wake up like super early and we'd go, and he's like, you have to really like what you do, but because otherwise when you wake up every morning and you go to work, you're going to be miserable. So like whatever you do, make sure that you love it and make sure that it's, it's important. And that's really stuck with me. And so that's why I was like, okay, I'm going to do this day job. And this is really, you're talking about millennials. I feel like we still are all like cobblers, just like cobbling all these jobs. Like we have our pay the bills job, and then we have our passion project, and then we have our creative project, and then we do this and we do that. And it used to be like that. You did 9 to 5 and you came home and no one, it was an emergency. They called your house phone that was attached to the wall. I heard a rumor that people weren't always reachable 24/7 back in the day. So, so that's really what influenced me, and that's really informed what I have done from there also in the past couple of years, and that's why I'm always happy to volunteer my time, in any way I can when it comes to mental health or anything where I can be useful. I'm usually jazzed for that.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because when I always have volunteered somewhere, and I'm 47, so a couple decades on you, but it's interesting to me how when I made a career shift in my early 40s to work in the field that I volunteer in, which is mental health. And it completely changed my life. Before that, I was a consultant in the business sector, and I was very conscious of, if I own a house or the clothes that I wore, not super into that, but I was, because of who I was around, my business clients, that was the atmosphere. And as soon as I got into this, I stopped caring. I don't care. That is not an influence in my life. I do not care if I have a house or what kind of clothes I wear, or money isn't a topic of discussion. That's not what motivates me. It's nice having it, but it's such a different way to live when you aren't trying to keep up with the Joneses,
Absolutely.
I try to tell that to, friends of mine that are mental health advocates. They're like, when am I going to make any money? And I said, well, you might not ever, but you've got to get to a place where you're okay with that because you love what you do so much. And then you're in an environment with other people where they don't care about that kind of stuff either. And then it becomes like where you live and how you live isn't part of the conversation or the comparative structure when you go out with people, because you're out with people that don't care about those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's really nice when you get to that place. I wish I would have gotten there, at your age, but it took me an extra 20 years to finally get there.
You listen, everyone gets there when they're supposed to, right?
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And please tell our listeners, where they can read your incredible writing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So my website is HelainaHovitz.com, and you can find information about my book there. You can read all my articles. There's a lot of articles.
And tell our listeners too the name of your book.
Oh, yes. So the name of my book is After 9/11, with the very short subtitle, One Girl's Journey Through Darkness to a New Beginning, which, that was my compromise, actually, because I really didn't want 9/11 to be in the title, believe it or not. And they said it had to be for SEO. And so I was like, fine, well, then I'm going to describe everything in the subtitle. And actually, I got married earlier this year, and at my bridal shower, one of the we played like Helaina trivia, and one of the questions was, what's the subtitle to her book? And only one person knew. so we could just call it After 9/11.
That's funny.
And yeah, so, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I make it a point to only share positive things for 99% of the time. And if I'm sharing something that is a little touchy, then it's definitely leading someone towards something positive, or because I feel like there's such an influx of negative information there with social media. So on my social channels, I really try to be a place people can go and they're just like, I don't want to read the 95th article about politics that is going to scare the crap out of me. Right. And on the other hand, it's also just like, oh, look, this dog and this cat are best friends and they're wearing party hats. Like, it's not fluff. Like, it's good stuff. I try to put good stuff out into the world. That's my MO. And so I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. On Facebook, it's Helaina Hovitz Regal, which is my husband's name. But that's when you're an author and a writer, you got to keep your byline. So
yeah, exactly. And I want to make sure everybody knows it's HelainaHovitz.com is your website, just in case they didn't know how to spell Helaina. So, well, again, thank you so much for coming on. This has been lovely, absolutely lovely.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you always to our listeners for another edition of Mental Health News Radio.
Get ready for it, because here it comes. But first, thank you again to our sponsors like EverythingEHR.com, devoted to helping organizations finding the best electronic health record in behavioral health, and Service Dogs by Warren Retrievers, SDWR.org, a nonprofit organization that provides service dogs to those with unique abilities and invisible diseases, to include autism, diabetes, epilepsy, and PTSD. Until there's a cure, there's a dog. And hey, an SDWR service dog is at work every day with one of our own team members. If you have a question, visit us at mentalhealthnewsradio.com or our network of podcasters at mhnrnetwork.com. Disruptors, healers, technologists, advocates, and most importantly, voices to be heard from all corners of the globe. Thank you so much for joining us.
And now a final word from our therapy dog, Miles.
Good boy.